Under the soft glow of a fading Roman sunset, the bustling streets of the empire's heart slowly began to quiet down. Merchants packed away their goods. Soldiers loosened their armor after a long day of patrol, and the air was thick with the smell of bread, olives, and a faint trace of smoke from distant hearths. It was in moments like this, when the city calmed, that the hidden heartbeat of Rome revealed itself, not in its grand temples or proud senators, but in the countless lives that toiled behind the scenes. Among them were the slaves, the silent force that kept the great machine of Rome turning. Their hands built the aqueducts, tended the fields, and prepared the lavish feasts that the elite enjoyed without a second thought. Yet few paused to ask, what was the cost of a human life in those times? How much would a Roman pay for a strong worker, a skilled tutor, or even a young child meant to serve a household for life? Imagine walking through a crowded Roman market where people bartered for everything: wine, oil, fine fabrics, and sometimes human beings. There would be wooden platforms lined with men, women, and children, their fates decided by the clinking of coins. The prices varied. A skilled Greek tutor could cost as much as a small estate, while a laborer for the fields might be traded for a modest sum of silver. But the price was never just in coins. It was also in the lost freedom, the dreams cut short, and the years surrendered to service. This story is not just about numbers. It is about the lives behind those numbers. Each price tag carried a story. Each sale shaped history in ways we rarely pause to imagine. Tonight, as you listen and drift into the quiet, we'll step back into that world. Not to judge it by our modern eyes, but to understand it. What determined a slave's worth? Was it their strength, their skills, their youth, or their origin? In the Roman world, value was often measured in harsh, practical terms. A young Gaul taken from the frontier might be seen as strong and able to endure hard labor, while a Greek scholar, captured or sold by misfortune, might fetch a fortune in the city for his ability to teach Latin-speaking children the wisdom of the ancient philosophers. There were house slaves, field slaves, gladiators, scribes, and even those who served in imperial palaces, each with their own price range, their own silent stories. Consider for a moment the human side of this ancient economy. Imagine being a father, selling yourself into bondage to pay off a debt, hoping one day to buy back your freedom. Or a child taken too young to understand the weight of the chains, standing on that platform as strangers assess your teeth, your posture, your future. These were real lives, and they made Rome's splendor possible. The wealth that glittered in marble forums and flowed through golden goblets often rested on their unseen shoulders. And yet, even within this grim system, there were chances for change. Some slaves could earn their freedom. Some even became wealthy, and a few rose to positions of influence, shaping the empire from within. As we move through this quiet night together, think of the rhythm of their days. The early rising, the endless labor, the whispered hopes for manumission, the legal act of being set free. For some, it was a distant dream. For others, a promised reward. The cost of a slave was not just silver. It was a calculation of risk and reward, a wager on how long a person could work before they broke, how much knowledge they could pass on, or how many harvests they could help bring in. And yet, behind every coin exchange was a heartbeat, a set of memories, a family left behind, or a name slowly forgotten. Rome's economy thrived on trade, conquest, and labor, and slavery was at its core. Wars filled the markets with captives, each one changing hands for a price that might seem shockingly precise to our modern ears. But it was not always brutal chains and whips. Some households treated their slaves as part of the family, entrusting them with children or estates. Others were cruel, seeing them as tools to be used and discarded. The truth, as always, lay in the gray spaces between, where survival often depended on luck, skill, or the whims of a master. So how much did a Roman slave truly cost? The answer is not a simple one. A field hand might sell for a few hundred denarii, roughly the wages of a soldier over several months. A rare and educated Greek slave, capable of tutoring senators' sons, could cost thousands, more than many free citizens would see in a lifetime. And there were even slaves whose talents in art, music, or healing were so prized that their value rivaled the grand villas of their owners. These numbers might sound distant, but they shaped daily life, dictated the rhythm of Roman commerce, and defined the fates of millions. As you let this picture settle in your mind, think of the contrast: the grand marble steps of the Senate, echoing with debates on empire and law, and just beyond those steps, a small group of people huddled, waiting for someone to decide their worth. History often speaks of emperors, battles, and victories, but rarely of the quiet transactions that built the foundations of those triumphs. Behind every great Roman feast, every triumphant parade, every newly conquered province, there were people bought and sold like goods, yet living, breathing, hoping. We are only beginning to scratch the surface of this world tonight. There are still questions hanging in the warm Roman air. Who decided these prices? How do they change over time? Could a slave ever refuse a sale? And perhaps most hauntingly, what happened when the market closed, when the buyers went home and the torches burned low, leaving only the quiet footsteps of those who had no choice but to follow? As you rest and listen, we will walk deeper into these questions, step by step, coin by coin, until the stories behind the silver come to life. But not yet, not tonight. The evening deepened, and the flicker of oil lamps danced across the worn stone walls of the Roman marketplace. The voices of merchants faded into murmurs as the last few buyers lingered. A soft breeze swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the distant hum of the Tiber River and the faint crackle of fires being stoked for the night. It was in these quieter hours that the true weight of the day settled, especially for those who had been bought or sold. Some clutched the small bundles they had managed to keep, perhaps a piece of cloth, a simple trinket, or a letter never sent. Others carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, their futures now tied to hands they had never held before that morning. In the heart of the city, the price of a slave was never just a number. It was a reflection of need, of wealth, of fear, and of ambition. A wealthy patrician might purchase a strong Thracian man to work his fields, believing his strength would bring a larger harvest. A widow with modest means might scrape together her savings to buy a young maid to help with her household chores, hoping it would ease her burdens in old age. Each transaction was layered with quiet motives, and often with unspoken desperation. Rome was a city of grandeur, yes, but it was also a city of survival. Imagine the auctioneer, standing tall upon his wooden platform, calling out the qualities of the person before him. Strong back, nose the plow, 30 years of age. His voice would rise above the crowd, each word a calculation of worth. A hand would go up, a price offered, then another, sometimes a brief contest of wealth and pride, other times a swift and silent exchange. The slaves themselves stood still, trained not to speak unless asked, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the crowd, as though staring into a life that was now out of reach. Their names might be changed by nightfall, their homes already a distant memory. The cost of slave could shift with the tides of war. After a successful campaign, when Roman legions returned with chains full of captives, the markets would flood and prices would fall. A farmer from Hispania might be sold for half the price of one bought during times of peace, simply because the supply had swelled beyond demand. But when wars waned and conquest slowed, the prices would rise again, and a single skilled craftsman could become the envy of an entire street. It was a market like any other, yet unlike any other, because what was being bought and sold was life itself. Not every story ended in chains forever. There were paths, narrow and often treacherous, toward freedom. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was a light that flickered faintly in the distance for many. A master might free a trusted servant after years of loyal service, or a slave might save enough money, through permitted work on the side, to buy his or her own freedom. There were even festivals, like Saturnalia, where for a brief time the roles of master and servant would reverse, a fleeting reminder that status, however rigid, could sometimes shift like sand. Yet, even in freedom, the mark of slavery often lingered. Former slaves, known as freedmen, carried their past like a shadow. Some thrived, becoming merchants, craftsmen, or even advisors to powerful men. Others found freedom to be a hollow gift, a life of poverty replacing a life of servitude. The price paid to the market was only the beginning of a far more complex journey, one that intertwined with the history of the empire itself. Picture a young woman, her hands rough from fieldwork, sold alongside her brother in a market far from their village. The buyer, a wealthy senator, saw in her the potential to manage his household. Her brother, judged strong and quick, was sent to toil in the vineyards. They would live under the same sky, perhaps only a few miles apart, yet never cross paths again. For the senator, they were investments. For the siblings, it was a sundering of a life they once shared. Such quiet, personal tragedies played out countless times, often unrecorded, lost between the lines of grand Roman histories. The question of how much a Roman slave cost cannot be answered without asking, what was the cost to them? To the ones whose names were erased, whose voices were softened to obedience. A coin could buy strength, but it could not buy the years lost in labor. A denarius could measure skill, but it could not measure the ache of separation from home. Even the wealthiest buyers, in their marble villas with painted walls and flowing fountains, rarely pause to consider that side of the bargain. The market tonight begins to close. Torches burn low, shadows grow longer, and the auctioneer counts his coins under a faded awning. The boy we left standing upon that platform still waits, his thin arms wrapped around himself against the chill of the evening. Buyers glance at him, too young for the fields, perhaps too frail for heavy work. Yet a scholar in the crowd sees something in his eyes, a quickness, a curiosity, a spark that might one day read and write. He whispers to his servant, and a price is named. The merchant hesitates, raises a brow, but then nods. The coins change hands, and with that soft clink of silver, a life tilts in a new direction. Tomorrow, the boy will wake in a strange house, to strange voices and unfamiliar walls. His name may change, his work will be decided for him, and the streets of his childhood will fade like a dream. For now, he looks back once, just once at the darkening market. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls the hour. The night swallows the sound, and the boy is led away. But this is only one story among thousands. The market will open again, with new faces, new prices, new lives hanging in the balance. The cost of a Roman slave was never a fixed thing. It was a living measure, rising and falling with the empire itself. And as the lamps go out, as the city settles into uneasy sleep, one question remains: what determines a person's worth, when worth is decided by the weight of a coin? The night in Rome grew still, the stars faint against the haze of distant smoke rising from bakeries that never truly closed. Somewhere, in the narrow alleys beyond the markets, a quiet hush wrapped itself over the cobblestones. For those who had been bought that day, sleep did not come easily. Some lay on straw mats in storerooms, trying to make sense of their new reality. Others found themselves in the courtyards of grand villas, the echo of marble floors beneath their steps reminding them of the distance between the life they once knew and the life that had just begun. The city's heart beat on, steady and indifferent, as the human tides shifted through its arteries. In the days that followed such transactions, the true price of a slave would unfold. A farmer who had paid for strong arms to plow his fields would soon find that not every pair of arms worked as expected. A merchant who bought a scribe to keep his accounts might discover a quick wit or, sometimes, a quiet rebellion hidden behind polite obedience. Rome's slave market was not only a place of purchase. It was a place of risk, of bargains struck in the dim light of ambition. And, for the ones sold, it was a turning point that could shape generations. Some were absorbed into households and, over time, became trusted stewards or even close confidants. Others labored until their bodies gave out, the price paid for them long forgotten by the ones who held their papers. Prices were as varied as the people themselves. In times of peace, when supply was thin, a strong man in his 20s skilled in farming or masonry, might cost between 500 to 1,500 denarii, a small fortune for the average citizen. Women, especially those with domestic skills or beauty prized by the wealthy, could be sold for similar or even higher amounts, depending on their perceived qualities. Children were often less expensive, yet they carried a longer potential for labor, and in some cruel calculations, this made them a profitable choice for those thinking far ahead. A literate Greek, capable of teaching language, philosophy, or arithmetic, could command prices that rivaled the earnings of a Roman officer for an entire year. And yet, these numbers, carefully etched into contracts and whispered in markets, told only half the story. The other half lived in the small, almost invisible details. The tired eyes of a mother scanning the crowd for a familiar face, the silent fear in a young man who once dreamed of becoming a soldier but now stood with his wrists marked by ropes. Even those who bought slaves were not always the caricatures of greed that later tales would paint. Some were struggling farmers themselves, hoping a pair of extra hands would save their next harvest. Others believed, perhaps honestly, that their household offered better chances than the streets or camps from which these souls had come. Rome was complex like that, layers of survival and power, always shifting. Imagine one particular household, tucked between the hills of the Aventine and the bustling Circus Maximus. There lived a matron named Livia, a widow of modest wealth. Her husband, a minor magistrate, had left her vineyards in Latium and a small city house. With no sons to carry the work, she visited the market one autumn to purchase 2 slaves, a boy to help with the vineyards and a young woman to tend her household. She counted her savings carefully, knowing each denarius mattered. The boy cost her 800 denarii. The young woman, skilled in weaving and kitchen work, cost 1,200. Livia did not think of herself as cruel. In fact, she prided herself on treating them fairly. Yet from their perspective, their lives had been uprooted, their choices reduced to obedience. Livia saw investment. They felt the weight of ownership. The law in Rome regarded them as property, but society was not entirely without its strange, shifting sense of humanity. Slaves could marry, though their unions were not always recognized by the state. They could bear children, though those children were born into the same condition. They could save coins if their masters permitted, building a small purse toward the distant, fragile hope of buying their freedom. In rare cases, a slave could rise beyond their station, especially those who served influential masters, secretaries, healers, or those trusted with trade. There were whispers in the streets of freedmen who became richer than their former owners, and even a few who bought the freedom of others, rewriting the story in which they had once been trapped. But for every story of hope, there were many more of silence. Fields in Sicily, mines in Hispania, quarries in Gaul. These places swallowed names, faces, and years without a trace. The mines, in particular, were said to break men faster than any other fate. There, the price of a slave was often low, for the work was dangerous, the conditions harsh, and the life expectancy cruelly short. A man bought for 400 denarii might never live to see the next summer, and yet his labor would fill Roman forges and line Roman roads. As the city slumbered, the boy from the market, the one whose fate we glimpsed, lay awake on a thin mat. He traced the cracks in the ceiling with his eyes, listening to the distant clatter of hooves on stone. Tomorrow, he would begin his lessons, carrying scrolls, sweeping floors, maybe even learning letters if his new master's promise was true. Part of him clung to that promise, the same way a sailor clings to a distant light. Part of him feared it was only a softer chain, dressed in kinder words. Somewhere beyond those walls, his sister, sold to a different house, might be staring at another ceiling, whispering his name. And so the question lingers, was freedom always measured in coins? The dawn came slowly to Rome, painting the rooftops with a soft, golden light that stretched across the city like a promise. The streets awoke with the sound of wheels clattering over stones, the bark of dogs, and the low murmur of people stirring to life. For many, it was just another day. Merchants arranging their stalls, bakers pulling fresh loaves from their ovens, and senators being carried in litters toward the forum. But for the newly bought slaves, it was a day that marked the beginning of a life they had not chosen. The city, grand and indifferent, offered no pause for their uncertainty. The markets would soon hum again, and the cycle of buying and selling would continue, as if the night had washed nothing away. The boy we followed, now in the house of his new master, rose before the first bell. He was given a piece of bread, a cup of watered wine, and instructions he barely understood. The house was large compared to his old home. Marble floors, tall columns, and mosaics of distant seas on the walls. It felt colder than any place he had known. The servants moved quietly, their faces lined with years of obedience. Some greeted him with a nod, others with averted eyes. He realized, even in that moment, that survival here meant more than strength. It meant learning the rhythm, the unspoken rules, the silent bargains that kept the household turning. Outside, the markets began to stir again. Prices shifted like the tide. News had arrived that a skirmish on the eastern frontier had brought captives from distant lands. Traders whispered that young men from Syria and Cappadocia would soon fill the auction blocks, their dark hair and quick hands prized for both farm and craft. In the north, a poor harvest meant fewer slaves were being bought for vineyards, while in the city, the demand for literate Greeks never seemed to wane. A single victory or loss in war could tilt the value of a human life by hundreds of denarii overnight. Rome itself was a city of contrasts. On one street, laughter spilled from a tavern as free citizens counted their winnings from a game of dice. On the next, a narrow doorway led to a courtyard where a dozen slaves, chained at the ankle, prepared to march toward the salt mines at dawn. The empire fed on labor, and while free men worked too, it was the unpaid hands that kept its vast heart beating. Roads stretched like veins across continents. Aqueducts carried water like lifeblood to the cities, and in the quiet of villas, meals appeared on silver plates as if by magic. But the magic was always someone else's burden. The price of a slave was not only silver and gold, it was also opportunity. Masters often calculated how quickly they could recover their investment. A skilled artisan might be worth a high sum if his work brought steady profit. A gladiator, young and strong, might cost a fortune but repay it in the roar of the arena. For those destined for the mines or the fields, the calculation was harsher. How many harvests could their back endure before it broke? And yet, despite the coldness of the market, some masters grew attached to their slaves, relying on them more than they admitted. Trust could form in the quiet hours of shared work, even friendship in rare cases, though always within the uneven balance of power. There were laws, too, shaping this trade. The Lex Aelius Sentia set limits on how and when a slave could be freed. The Lex Fufia Caninia restricted the number that could be released by will upon a master's death. Freedom was possible, yes, but it was controlled, measured, and often dependent on the master's favor. Some slaves, particularly those who managed finances or served as secretaries, found ways to earn extra coin. A few saved enough to buy their own freedom, a rare and fragile triumph, often years in the making. In the villa where the boy now served, he was shown the library, a small room lined with scrolls. The scholar who had chosen him looked him over, not with cruelty, but with calculation. "You have quick eyes," he said. "Quick eyes make quick hands, and quick hands can hold a pen." The boy said nothing, unsure if this was a blessing or a chain in finer wrapping. His fingers brushed the edge of scroll, feeling the faint dust of its parchment. Somewhere, deep inside, a spark of curiosity stirred. Perhaps this was how some survived, not by strength alone, but by learning, by making themselves useful in ways that silver could not fully measure. Elsewhere in the city, a woman carried water from the well to the home of her mistress, each step a reminder of the price paid for her body many years ago. She had been young then, barely 14, sold with the promise of a better life. Now, in her 30s, she knew the names of every street, the temper of every season, and the habits of every neighbor. She dreamed not of escape, Where would she go? But of manumission, the day her mistress, now aging, might free her for her years of loyal service. She had saved 30 denarii in a small clay pot under her sleeping mat. It was not enough, not yet, but each coin felt like a stone in a path slowly being laid. The city around them pulsed with wealth and ruin, with ambition and resignation. Senators debated taxes while soldiers counted spoils. Children played with wooden toys on the same steps where prisoners had once been paraded. The slaves, visible yet overlooked, were threads in the tapestry, pulling tight the edges that made Rome's grandeur possible. Their cost was more than silver. It was a measure of what Rome was willing to take from the many to enrich the few. As the sun climbed higher, the market swelled again. Merchants raised their voices, calling out the traits of the men and women on the platforms. Buyers pressed forward, haggling, inspecting teeth, asking questions about strength and skills. The smell of figs and sweat mingled in the air. A Roman matron passed, her fingers brushing a silk purse heavy with coins. A farmer paused, counting the silver he had scraped together from a season's toil. Each coin he held was a piece of his own life, now about to be exchanged for someone else's. And so the cycle continued, day after day, year after year. Wars brought floods of captives, peace raised prices, and the city itself grew fatter on the backs of those who rarely saw their names etched in stone. Somewhere in the city tonight, a deal would be made that would echo across a generation. A child bought for a few hundred denarii might one day shape the fate of a household. A man sold for the price of a horse might carve his name quietly. The days passed in quiet rhythm, each one adding a new thread to the boy's life in the Roman household. The city outside the villa continued to hum with the noise of carts and traders, the scent of olives, and the heat rising from the stones. Inside, time moved differently, marked not by the city's bustle, but by the slow rituals of work, study, and silence. He swept the floors of the library each morning, arranged the scrolls in careful rows, and listened to the footsteps of the scholar who now directed his days. The man's name was Marcus, a freedman himself, whose own life had once been bought for silver before he earned the right to walk the streets as a free citizen. His manner was calm, yet his eyes were sharp, always watching, always weighing. Marcus had a quiet way of teaching. He did not shout, nor did he often praise. Instead, he would hand the boy a small task, cleaning a stylus, fetching ink, copying a line of simple text, and watch how quickly it was done. In these small tasks, the boy began to see the hidden layers of the house. There were others like him, an older man who tended the courtyard garden, a young girl who wove cloth for the household, a cook whose hands were rough from years of work. Each had a story, whispered in the quiet of shared chores. None spoke too loudly of their pasts. It was safer that way. The market where they had all once stood was never far from their minds. Prices were spoken of in hushed tones, like distant ghosts. The cook had once cost 600 denarii, bought for her skill with spices. The gardener, now gray-haired, had been sold for 450, a sum his old master once boasted was a bargain for strong shoulders. These numbers clung to them, not just as history, but as a measure of how the world saw them. The boy wondered sometimes what his own price had been whispered as that day. Was it high because of his youth, or low because his arms were thin? The thought stayed with him, like a shadow at the edge of his work. Beyond the villa's walls, the empire stretched in all directions, restless and vast. News came in fragments, whispers of unrest in the provinces, rumors of new conquests, merchants speaking of caravans from the east bringing silk and spices. Each rumor carried with it a ripple that touched the slave markets. When a border flared with war, prices dropped as captives flooded in. When peace lingered too long, they rose, and buyers weighed their coins more carefully. The boy began to see how his fate, and the fates of those around him, were tied to events far beyond their sight. Battles fought on distant fields, treaties signed in marble halls. Livia, the matron of the house, was a figure both kind and distant. She moved with quiet authority, her hair tied in the old Roman style, her fingers always tracing the edge of a ring she had worn since her husband's death. To her, the slaves were part of the household, like the olive trees or the carved fountains. Necessary, valuable, but not equal. Yet she was not unkind. There were no cruel punishments here, only the unspoken weight of expectation. A task left undone might mean a missed meal. A careless word might earn a sharp rebuke. The boy watched her carefully, learning when to speak and when to remain invisible. At night, the villa would settle into a hush, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the courtyard and the distant sounds of Rome's night watch. The boy lay awake often, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere beyond those walls, his sister might still be out there, her life unfolding in a different household. He imagined her carrying water jars, or perhaps tending a wealthy woman's children. The thought of her kept him anchored, a reminder that his story was not only his own. Marcus, too, carried the weight of his past in silence. One evening, as they arranged the scrolls together, the boy dared to ask him how he had become free. Marcus paused, the lamplight catching the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "I bought my name back," he said at last, his voice low. "Years of work, saving every coin I could. And even then, freedom is only a word. You carry where you've been with you, always." He did not speak again that night, but the boy remembered those words. There was a sense in the villa that something was shifting. Livia had begun receiving letters sealed with red wax, her brow furrowed as she read them in the afternoon light. Marcus whispered once that the vineyards were in trouble. The marketplace began to change as the morning turned into midday. The sun hung higher, casting long shadows across the stone floors, and the once cool breeze felt heavier with the heat. Gaius wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and noticed the traders were starting to shout louder, each trying to make their voices rise above the others. Prices shifted as the day moved on, and sometimes they changed by the hour. A strong young man, skilled in farming or construction, might fetch more coins now than he would at dawn. A household maid, trained to cook or clean, might be offered a lower price simply because the crowd was thinning and merchants didn't want to leave without making a sale. It was a dance of money, timing, and luck, one that most people never got to see from the inside. Cassius noticed it too. He whispered to Gaius that the prices were not just about the strength or beauty of the person on the platform, but about the mood of the crowd, the season, and the needs of the city that day. In harvest season, more workers meant a bigger crop. In winter, skilled cooks or caretakers might be in demand for wealthy households preparing for long nights and feasts. There was no fixed number, no list you could follow. A slave might be bought for a few hundred denarii, or 1,000, or several thousand sesterces, depending on what they could offer and who wanted them most. Nearby, an old man in worn clothes watched the sales with tired eyes. His name was Lucius, and he had once been a merchant himself, trading olive oil along the coast. Years ago, he had fallen into debt when a storm sank his shipment and his creditors came knocking. Unable to pay, he had sold his own belongings piece by piece until finally he sold his labor. Now he worked in a small workshop, crafting tools, still free, but living a life that felt only a step away from the chains he saw before him. He told Gaius quietly that many who stood on those platforms were there not because they had done wrong, but because fate had turned against them. War, storms, or unpaid debts often pushed people to the edge. The more they listened, the more layers they uncovered. A Greek teacher, sold for a high price because of his knowledge of philosophy and languages, was led away by a senator who wanted his sons to learn eloquence. A group of young men from distant provinces, sunburned and silent, were purchased by a wealthy landowner for work in his vineyards. Each had a different story, a different path that led them here. Yet in this place, their value was reduced to numbers. It was a harsh truth that made Gaius think of how easily fortunes could change in this world. As they walked through the side streets, they saw shops where freedmen ran their own businesses, cobblers, bakers, metalworkers. Some had once been slaves themselves, earning or being granted their freedom after years of service. Cassius pointed out one such man, Marcus, who now owned a small bakery. He had bought his freedom after 20 years in a wealthy household. He spoke kindly to the boys, telling them that not every story ended in sorrow, but even then, freedom had its price. He had paid nearly 500 denarii to walk as a free man, and even after that, his old master still expected favors, still held a kind of invisible chain over him. Gaius found himself thinking not only about the prices of people, but about the cost of staying free. In Rome, wealth and status protected you from that platform, but only so long as luck remained on your side. A bad season, a lost bet, a war gone wrong, and everything could change. It was a fragile balance, one that kept the streets alive with both ambition and fear. By late afternoon, the market began to slow. The shouts grew quieter, and a tired calm settled over the square. The last buyers haggled over the few remaining men and women, their prices lowered out of desperation. Gaius and Cassius turned to leave, their heads full of what they had seen. But as they stepped away, a commotion broke out at the far end of the market. Soldiers in red cloaks were moving through the crowd, their faces stern, their hands on the hilts of their swords. People whispered as they passed, wondering who they were after. The soldiers stopped at a platform where a young man had just been sold. He was tall, with dark hair and a defiant stare. The buyer, a wealthy man in a purple-trimmed toga, was already signing the deal when the lead soldier stepped forward and snatched the papers from his hand. There was a heated exchange, words lost in the rising noise, and then the young man was taken away by force. The buyer protested, but the soldiers ignored him. They disappeared down the alley, leaving behind questions and a crowd now buzzing with uneasy curiosity. Gaius wanted to ask who the man was, but no one seemed to know. Some said he was a prisoner of war whose ransom had not been properly paid. Others whispered that he was a runaway, returned by the gods to face punishment. A few murmured something darker, that he was connected to a plot or a secret the city was trying to bury. The truth was unclear, but the tension it left behind was heavy. Cassius pulled at Gaius's sleeve, telling him it was time to leave before the soldiers returned. They walked quickly, but their minds were restless. That moment had turned the day from a lesson into a riddle. Who had the power to take a man back after he was sold? What made him worth more to the city than to the man who had just paid for him? And how often did such things happen in the shadows of Roman markets, unseen by most? The sun dipped lower as they made their way home, the streets now glowing with the gold of late afternoon. Gaius's father was waiting for them at the doorway, asking what they had learned. Gaius wanted to tell him everything, the prices, the faces, the stories, but his thoughts kept circling back to that moment with the soldiers. His father listened, his eyes narrowing slightly, and told him that in Rome, prices were only one part of the story. Power, he said, was the true coin of the empire, and it could buy or break anyone. That night, Gaius lay awake on a straw bed, staring at the wooden beams above him. He thought about the man with the defiant eyes, about Marcus the baker, about the Greek teacher led away with a promise of fine meals and high halls. The city was full of people with prices on their heads, some obvious, some hidden. And somewhere in that market, among the fading shouts and clinking coins, there were secrets still waiting to be uncovered. Would the young man taken by the soldiers ever be seen again? Why had his sale been interrupted? And how much power did it really take to change a life in Rome? Not with coins, but with a whisper or a command. These questions lingered in the air as the night deepened, unanswered, stretching like shadows across the ancient streets. The moon was rising above the rooftops of Rome when Gaius finally drifted into a restless sleep. But even in his dreams, the marketplace returned to him. The noise, the heat, the smell of sweat and spices, and above all, the sight of the young man being dragged away by soldiers. There had been something in that man's eyes that unsettled him, a kind of fire that didn't belong to someone broken by chains. He woke before dawn, his heart still beating fast, and for a moment he wondered if it had been a dream after all. But the memory of the soldiers' red cloaks was too sharp to forget. At breakfast, his father spoke little, which was unlike him. Normally, He would fill the table with stories of the Senate and the latest gossip from the forum. But today he seemed distracted, his gaze fixed on the cup in his hand. Gaius and Cassius exchanged a quick glance. It felt like their father knew more than he was saying. Finally, Gaius asked, as casually as he could, "Father, why would soldiers take someone after they've been sold?" The question hung in the air like smoke. His father set down his cup and looked at him carefully, his expression hard to read. "There are reasons," he said slowly. "Some simple, some not so simple. Sometimes it's law, sometimes it's power, and sometimes it's because someone is more valuable than anyone in that market knows." He didn't say more, and when Gaius pressed, his father raised a hand and told him to leave the matter alone. But the warning only made Gaius want to know more. Later that morning, Gaius and Cassius walked toward the forum. The streets were already alive with chatter, traders shouting their prices, children chasing each other between stalls, and messengers hurrying with sealed scrolls. But mixed with the usual noise was a new murmur, a whisper that kept drifting from one group to another. People were talking about the soldiers. Some said the man they took was a runaway gladiator, dangerous and cunning. Others claimed he was a soldier himself once, one who had betrayed his legion and stolen secrets meant only for the generals. A few even whispered that he was not a slave at all, but someone important, someone hiding under a false name. The stories grew wilder with every telling. As they passed a group of older men near a fountain, Gaius slowed his steps to listen. One of them, his voice low but urgent, said that the man had been taken to the Tullianum, the ancient prison beneath the Forum, where Rome kept those too dangerous to let roam free. Another man scoffed, saying no ordinary slave would be thrown into such a place. But no one agreed on the truth. What was clear, though, was that something unusual had happened yesterday, something that would not fade quickly. Cassius tugged at Gaius's arm, pulling him along before anyone noticed them listening. "We shouldn't get involved," he whispered. "Father will be furious if he finds out." Gaius nodded, but in his heart, the curiosity burned stronger than any fear. He wanted to see the Tullianum, to know if the whispers were true. Not today, maybe, but soon. They reached the Forum, where senators in white togas moved through the marble columns, their voices carrying over the hum of the crowd. Stalls lined the edges, selling everything from scrolls of law to trays of figs. It was a world away from the noise of the slave market, yet somehow connected. The same men who argued here about justice and order were the ones who profited from chains and sales. Gaius thought about that as he walked past the steps of the Curia, the Senate House, where men spoke of virtue while their wealth came from fields worked by hands that would never know freedom. As they wandered, they came upon a scribe sitting under a shaded arch, writing letters for those who could not write themselves. Gaius gave him a coin and asked casually, "Have you heard of the man the soldiers took yesterday?" The scribe's pen paused in midair. His eyes flicked up sharply before softening into a smile. "Ah," he said, "so even the boys are curious." He lowered his voice and leaned closer. "I heard something that he was a Thracian. Strong, clever. Fought in the wars against Dacia. Men like that don't break easily." He shrugged and dipped his pen again. "Of course, I only know what the streets know, and the streets know little." Gaius thanked him, but the words stayed in his mind. Men like that don't break easily. The day stretched on, and by evening, Gaius felt as if he were walking through two Romes, one of shining marble, senators and speeches, and another of shadows, secrets, and silent chains. The price of a slave was no longer just a number to him. It was a mask, hiding lives that were worth far more, or far less, than anyone admitted. The night stretched on, heavy and silent, as Gaius sat in his bed with eyes wide open. Sleep no longer seemed possible. In the room next to his father spoke in low tones with the stranger, their voices muffled by thick walls and the crackle of a small oil lamp. Gaius could only catch fragments, mentions of ships, names he didn't recognize, something about a contract broken and a debt unpaid. It wasn't the talk of a simple runaway. This was something else, something tied to the very heart of how power and wealth moved in Rome. He thought of the marketplace again, The way the merchants had called out their prices as if selling jars of oil or bolts of cloth. There had been an order to it, yet beneath that order, there was something unpredictable, almost dangerous. A man could be worth 1,000 denarii in the morning and yet be dragged away by soldiers in the afternoon. A young girl trained to sing might fetch more coins than a strong farmhand if the buyer had the right kind of ambition. It all seemed to depend not only on the person being sold, but on the tides of politics, the needs of powerful men, and the secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Cassius stirred in his sleep and mumbled something, but Gaius stayed awake, the night whispering its questions into his ear. What was the real price of a person in Rome? Was it just the silver counted out in a merchant's hand, or was it something deeper? Loyalty, silence, knowledge, even danger? The man in their house had not looked broken. If anything, he looked like someone who had seen the price placed upon him and refused to bow to it. The following morning, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Their father left early, saying he had business at the forum. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, and the servants avoided Gaius's gaze as if they knew more than they wished to share. Cassius, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, asked no questions. He was cautious by nature, always ready to step back when things seemed uncertain. But Gaius's curiosity only grew. He went into the city again, this time alone. The streets smelled of fresh bread and damp stone, and the hum of daily life had returned to its usual rhythm. Yet in the corners of conversations, the whispers still lingered. People spoke of new taxes, of rumors that the Senate might raise the price on imported grain, of a senator's daughter betrothed to a man she had never met. But here and there, the story of the market resurfaced. Some said the soldiers had acted on orders from a magistrate. Others claimed it was the emperor's men, acting in secret. Near the baths, an old freedman named Publius was telling a small crowd about the prices he had seen in his youth. He had once served in a household near the Palatine Hill, cooking for senators and their guests. In those days, he said, leaning on his cane, a skilled cook could fetch 500 denarii, sometimes more if he knew the recipes from the East. A strong man for the fields? 300 for 100 if he had no scars. But a Greek teacher? A doctor? Thousands. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And yet, Publius added with a bitter smile, none of those coins could guarantee safety. All it took was a change in fortune, a whisper in the wrong ear, and even the rich found themselves wearing chains. Gaius asked him if he had ever seen someone taken after being sold. The old man chuckled softly. "Oh yes," he said. "It happened more than you think. Sometimes they called it a mistake in the paperwork. Other times it was because the man was worth more to someone else, someone with power. And in Rome, power always speaks louder than silver." The word stayed with him as he made his way back home. The city's stones felt different beneath his feet now, as though every step echoed with the weight of secrets. Rome was vast and loud, full of life, but it was also a place where a single name whispered in the wrong place could change everything. That evening, his father returned, his face tired, his clothes marked by dust from the forum. Gaius watched him carefully as they ate. He wanted to ask about the man, but the warning from the night before still rang in his ears. Instead, he asked a different question. "Father, how does one decide the worth of a man?" Truly, his father paused, then set down his cup. "Worth," he said, "is not decided by the market alone. It is decided by who needs you, who fears you, or who wishes to control you. In the market, they count coins. In the Senate, they count influence. On the battlefield, they count loyalty. All of it is worth, and none of it is fair." That night, the stranger appeared again, this time in the courtyard where the moonlight pooled on the stones. He spoke little, but when Gaius passed by, their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no fear there, no pleading, only a quiet resolve, as if the man already knew the price on his own head and had chosen not to run from it. Days passed, but the tension in the household only deepened. Visitors came late at night, their cloaks drawn tight, their voices low. Gaius caught fragments, mentions of the port at Ostia, a senator's signature, a shipment delayed. It was not the life of a simple merchant's family anymore. It was something else, something heavier. And then one morning, the man was gone. No one said a word about his leaving. His father acted as though nothing had changed. The servants kept their eyes down. But Gaius knew better. Something had been set in motion, something that would not stay hidden forever. In the streets, the whispers grew louder. Some said a ship had left Ostia under cover of night, carrying someone of great importance. Others claimed a raid was coming soon, that the Senate was looking for those who meddled with their orders. And through it all, the marketplace continued its rhythm, buying, selling, shouting prices to the sky, as though the city itself did not care what shadows moved beneath its surface. Gaius, however, could not let it go. He kept thinking of the stranger's face, the weight of his father's warning, and the words of Publius. Power speaks louder than silver. What did that mean for those still on the platform tomorrow? Would their prices rise or fall with the whim of men in the Senate? Could one decision in a marble hall decide the fate of dozens in the marketplace? And more than anything, what had his father risked to take that man in, and what would the cost be when Rome came asking for payment? The questions built upon each other like stones in a wall, and behind that wall, something waited, something Gaius could not yet see but felt growing closer with every passing day. The next few days in Rome passed with an unsettling calm, but beneath that calm, Gaius sensed a tension spreading like cracks in old marble. The slave market carried on as always. Merchants still shouted their prices, ships still arrived with their human cargo from faraway provinces, and buyers still argued over silver coins and contracts. Yet the soldiers were seen more often now, patrolling the streets with their crimson cloaks billowing in the wind. Their presence reminded everyone that the empire was not built only on trade and law, but also on fear and force. Gaius found himself drawn back to the marketplace one afternoon, hoping to see if anyone would speak of the man taken by the soldiers. Cassius refused to go with him this time, preferring to stay home and keep out of trouble, but Gaius could not let it go. As he stepped into the crowded square, the familiar smell of oil lamps and sun-baked stone filled his lungs. The platforms were full again, with men and women from Gaul, Thrace, Germania, and the eastern provinces waiting under the harsh gaze of merchants. Their prices were shouted aloud as if they were objects, not people. 300 denarii for a field hand, 500 for a scribe, 1,000 for a skilled Greek tutor. But every now and then, Gaius noticed how a whisper or a single nod from a buyer could change everything. How a man's value could rise or fall in an instant without a single coin exchanged yet. He lingered near a trader who looked older than most, his hair silver and his eyes sharp. The man spoke in a low voice to a potential buyer about a woman from Hispania, saying her skill in weaving was worth twice what another merchant had asked for. The buyer hesitated, glancing at the woman's wrists, bound in rope. "How much?" the buyer asked finally. The old trader smiled faintly and said, "What she is worth depends not on her hands, but on your needs." Gaius stepped closer, pretending to examine a tray of pottery while listening. The trader spoke as though the market was not about the person at all, but about the hunger of those who bought them. As the sun lowered and shadows grew long, a group of soldiers entered the square again, and the crowd fell silent for a moment. Gaius felt the air grow heavy, remembering that day when they had taken the mysterious man. These soldiers, though, were different, less hurried, more watchful. They did not seize anyone this time, but their presence was enough to remind the merchants that they were never truly in control. The soldiers moved from stall to stall, inspecting documents, asking questions, and leaving behind unease in their wake. After they left, Gaius approached a freedman named Publius, an older man he had met before who often loitered near the markets, offering advice to those who sought it. "You see them again?" Publius said with a sigh, following Gaius's gaze. "This is what Rome does. It counts every coin, every name, every face. You think you own a man when you buy him, but in truth, the empire owns him first. And sometimes it decides to take him back." Gaius hesitated, then asked, "How much did a man like the one they took cost?" Publius rubbed his chin. "A Thracian fighter? If he was strong, maybe 800 denarii. 1,000 if someone believed he could win them a fortune in the arena. But if he had something more, knowledge, loyalty to someone powerful, then his price was not in coins. His price was in secrets. Those words followed Gaius home as the city lights flickered in the distance. He began to see the markets differently now, not as rows of goods and shouting traders, but as a place where wealth, power, and fear tangled together. Each chain held more than wrists. It held debts, bargains, promises, and betrayals. A man could cost a few hundred coins, yet be priceless to someone far away. That night, his father spoke a little more at dinner, though never directly about the stranger. He mentioned that the Senate had been restless, that certain names were being spoken in quiet halls, and that merchants were being warned not to meddle in affairs too large for their hands. Cassius listened with a furrowed brow, saying nothing, but Gaius felt each word sink like a stone in his chest. His father's eyes met his for only a moment, as if to say, "You know enough, do not ask for more." But Gaius could not stop asking, even if only in his mind. He thought of the ships in Ostia, bringing goods and people from the edges of the empire. He thought of the Greek tutors, the Gallic farmers, the Nubian craftsmen, all with different prices but the same silence when the coin changed hands. And he thought of the man in their garden that night, the one whose worth could not be spoken aloud. A week passed, and news spread quietly. A senator's estate had been raided on the outskirts of the city. No one said why, only that soldiers came at dawn and left with scrolls, chests, and 2 servants in chains. Whispers linked it to the man from the market, though no one dared speak it too loud. Some said he had escaped. Others claimed he had been seen boarding a ship disguised as a merchant. Every version of the story left more holes than answers. One evening, as the lamps burned low, Gaius overheard his father speaking with a visitor, a man whose voice was sharp and measured. "The cost is already paid," the man said, "but the eyes are watching now. You must choose your side before they close in." His father replied with a weary sigh, "Sides mean little when the game is played above our heads." The door closed soon after, and the night returned to its quiet hum. The city, too, went on as if nothing had changed. Gladiators fought in the arena. Merchants sold their goods, senators argued over taxes, and slaves carried water through the narrow streets. Yet, beneath it all, the weight of something unseen pressed against the stones. Gaius felt it in every corner, the sense that Rome's power was not only in its armies or its laws, but in the invisible prices it placed on lives. He began keeping notes, small scraps of parchment hidden under his bed, names of those sold, the prices called out, the faces of buyers and sellers. He did not know why he wrote them, only that something inside him wanted to understand the pattern, to see the thread that tied all these stories together. But the more he wrote, the less the numbers seemed to matter. A man was not truly worth 400 denarii or 1,000 sesterces. A man was worth what someone was willing to risk for him, and that could not be written in any ledger. One night, as he set down his stylus, he heard movement in the courtyard again. This time, when he stepped outside, no one was there. Only the cool air and the distant sound of the Tiber flowing under the stars. He stood there for a long time, wondering if the man had ever truly left Rome, or if he was still somewhere in its maze of streets, carrying the weight of a price no one dared to name. What debt had been paid to bring him here? What bargain had been struck in the shadows? And how long before the empire demanded its due in return? These questions followed Gaius into sleep, and in his dreams, the marketplace returned, empty this time, silent under a dark sky. The platforms were bare, the ropes hanging loose, and yet he felt the presence of countless unseen lives, waiting to be counted, bought, or taken. As the flicker of the oil lamp dimmed and the room grew quieter, Marcus sat with his thoughts still tangled in the heavy air of that evening. The words he had heard from Lucius echoed faintly, stirring a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The cost of a life measured in coins. It seemed absurd, yet here in the heart of Rome, it was common. Each coin represented a story, a human face, a voice that once laughed or cried, now tied to a number on a wax tablet. He wondered if the senator he served ever thought of such things when calculating how much a skilled scribe might fetch, or how many coins would be saved by buying a child rather than a man. The system was old, older than the streets of marble, and yet it thrived because no one truly challenged its roots. Late that night, a faint sound came from the courtyard. Marcus rose, curious but cautious, and stepped into the cool night air. There, by the shadow of the olive tree, two figures whispered in hurried tones. He recognized them as fellow servants, Livia and Publius. Their voices carried urgency, and though he tried not to intrude, a fragment of their conversation reached him. They spoke of someone being sold away, a boy barely 12, whose skills with numbers had drawn the attention of a merchant from a port. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. The boy was Tyro, the one who had often run errands for the senator, quick-witted and eager to please. The thought of him being priced like a crate of figs stirred something in Marcus that he could not name. Was it anger, sorrow, or something deeper? The next morning, life in the villa resumed its steady rhythm. The clinking of pottery, the calls of vendors outside, and the distant sound of hooves on the stone road filled the air. Yet beneath it all, there was an undercurrent, a sense that something was shifting. Marcus carried out his tasks, polishing the bronze vessels, fetching scrolls from the atrium, arranging the senator's writing tools, but his mind wandered. How did one measure worth in such a city? Was it skill, beauty, strength, or obedience? Or was it simply the luck of being born free, something that cost nothing yet meant everything? Later that day, Lucius appeared again, this time with a ledger under his arm. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the courtyard. He motioned Marcus closer. "Come," he said softly. "You have a steady hand, and I trust your silence. There are accounts to tally." In the dim light of the storage room, Marcus watched as Lucius laid out the wax tablets, each marked with figures, names, and strange notations. One name caught his eye, Tyro. Next to it, a number, 30 denarii. It felt cold, seeing a friend's existence boiled down to such a line. "Is this truly how it is decided?" Marcus asked, unable to hold his tongue. Lucius did not look up, his stylus scratching lightly on the wax. "Decided? No, boy. It is recorded. The market decides, the need decides. If a merchant wants a skilled boy and can pay, the household profits. If the boy is clever, he may one day buy his freedom. That is how it has always been." That night, Marcus lay awake. The moonlight stretched long shadows across the room. He thought of Tyro, of the many others whose names might be etched in such ledgers. Somewhere beyond the hills, in the bustling forum, men and women exchanged silver and promises over lives that once ran freely in distant lands. The conflict in Marcus grew, a mix of fear and awakening. He began to see how fragile his own place was. Freedom was not a certainty. It was a privilege perched on a thin line. The following days unfolded with a strange tension. Rumors stirred among the household staff. Some said the senator planned to host a gathering for wealthy traders. Others whispered of debts owed and assets to be shifted. Marcus noticed how Lucius guarded the tablets more closely, how conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Each passing day, the boy Tyro grew quieter. His usual spark dimmed as if he sensed the tide pulling him away. Then came the evening when the senator called for Marcus directly. It was unusual. He was rarely summoned alone. The room smelled of parchment and wine. The senator, a man of strong features and deliberate calm, gestured for Marcus to sit. "You are observant," he said, pouring a cup. "Tell me, do you think it is wrong to measure a life in coins?" The question caught Marcus off guard. I do not know if it is wrong, master," he said carefully, "but I know it feels heavy." The senator leaned back, studying him. "Heavy, yes, but the empire is built on what is practical, not always on what feels light. A field does not till itself. A ledger does not balance with kindness. We make choices because we must." His words were not harsh, but they carried the weight of an old truth. From that moment, Marcus found himself drawn into a web he could not yet name. He was asked to assist with more than chores. He carried notes, delivered sealed letters, copied lists of names. Each task felt small, but together they painted a larger picture of trade, profit, and quiet exchanges that decided the fates of many. And with each day, the question grew louder in his heart. Could one voice, one simple act, ever change such a machine? As the villa prepared for the arrival of guests, Marcus overheard something that made his pulse quicken. A trader from the East, known for his wealth and his hunger for rare talent, was coming. His interest was not in land or grain, but in those who could write, calculate, and interpret languages, the same qualities that made Tyro valuable. That night, Marcus found the boy in the kitchen, staring at the floor as the fire crackled low. "They will take you, won't they?" Marcus whispered. Tyro looked up, eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. "I think so. They say I will have better food, better clothes. But I will not see the olive trees here again." The room fell silent, save for the slow burning of wood. Marcus felt something turn within him, not just sadness, but a seed of defiance. He did not know what form it would take or what danger it might bring, but he knew he could not keep watching silently as names turned into numbers and numbers into lost faces. Beyond the hills, the city of Rome glimmered with promise and peril. Men debated laws, merchants bargained under the sun, and on the outskirts of it all, lives shifted quietly, almost invisibly, under the weight of commerce and tradition. Somewhere within that great, bustling heart, a choice would soon have to be made. And Marcus, though still unsure of his path, began to feel the edges of it forming. Would he remain a quiet observer, a hand that copied the figures, or would he risk the delicate balance of his place for something he did not yet fully understand? The question hung in the air like a distant storm, too far to touch, yet close enough to make the wind restless. And as the days crept toward the trader's arrival, the tension in the household thickened, each moment a thread waiting to snap. The moon that night hung low and full, casting its pale light on the courtyard. Marcus sat by the window, listening to the quiet murmurs of the villa. Somewhere in the city, prices were being agreed upon, decisions made in candlelit rooms, while those bound to them waited in silence. Tomorrow, perhaps, the name Tyro would be crossed from one tablet and written on another. And somewhere, perhaps, a plan would be born, not just to stop it, but to understand why such a system held so many lives in its grasp. Would the senator see reason? Would Lucius guard his secrets? Or would the merchant arrive with his purse full and his promises ready? The night offered no answers, only questions and the faint rustle of the olive leaves in the Roman breeze. The villa awoke before the sun the next morning. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of dew settling on the stone paths and the faint rustle of the olive branches swaying in the breeze. Marcus moved quietly through the courtyard, carrying a basket of fresh bread to the kitchen. He noticed how the servants moved faster than usual, their faces set with a kind of strained anticipation. The trader from the east was expected by midday, and with him came a flurry of preparation that felt less like celebration and more like an impending judgment. Tyro was nowhere to be seen. That absence weighed on Marcus more than the early hour. He searched for the boy in the usual places, the stables, the storage room, the small corner by the workshop where he liked to sit with scraps of parchment, but found no trace of him. It was as if Tyro had become a shadow, waiting to be carried away by the wind of someone else's decision. By the time the sun climbed over the rooftops, the villa was alive with the clinking of bronze vessels and the low hum of servants trying not to be heard. Lucius appeared once more, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the preparations. Marcus caught his eye and, without words, was summoned to follow him. They walked along the edge of the garden, the stone path cool beneath their sandals. Lucius finally spoke. "You wonder about the boy," he said, not asking but stating. "I do," Marcus admitted, careful with his tone. "He is young. He has a quick mind. Will he truly be better off elsewhere?" Lucius glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips, though there was no warmth in it. Better is a word for poets. The market does not know such things. It knows value. It knows what a merchant will pay and what a household will gain. That is all. The words settled between them like dust. Marcus wanted to argue, but what could he say that had not been said by countless others before him? The system was older than both of them, older than the senator, older even than the stones of the villa itself. To speak against, it was like speaking against the tide. By mid-morning, the distant sound of hooves echoed on the road. A small caravan appeared beyond the gate, 3 mules, a covered cart, and a man in a deep blue cloak riding at the front. The merchant. He dismounted with practiced ease, his eyes sweeping the villa with the quick, assessing glance of someone used to buying and selling more than just goods. The senator welcomed him with a measured smile, their voices low and cordial as they exchanged pleasantries. Marcus stood at a distance, pretending to busy himself with a tray of fruit, but his eyes followed every movement. Tyro appeared then, led by an older servant, his face pale but composed. He held a small bundle in his hands, his only belongings, perhaps. The merchant's gaze lingered on him, appraising, calculating. A few words were exchanged, a scroll produced, a small bag of coins shown briefly before being tucked away again. Marcus felt his stomach knot. Was this how it always happened? So simple, so quiet, like a transaction for grain or oil. As the day wore on, the negotiations stretched longer than expected. There were interruptions, messages arriving, other servants summoned, a minor dispute over the price of imported spices that delayed the meeting. Marcus used the chaos to slip closer to Tyro, who sat in the corner of the courtyard, staring at the mosaic floor. "Do you want to go?" Marcus whispered. Tyro shook his head slowly. "It does not matter what I want. They say I will learn more there, maybe even read the stars for him one day. But I liked it here. I knew the paths. I knew the faces." Marcus felt a heaviness in his chest. He had no power to change the scrolls or the coins, but he felt a stirring, an urge to act, even in some small way. That evening, the merchant stayed for supper, and the villa's halls filled with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. The senator laughed lightly at the man's stories of faraway markets, of ports filled with silks and spices. Yet beneath the laughter, there was calculation, 2 men speaking in a language that weighed profit against humanity, where a clever boy's fate was a column in their ledger. Marcus lingered by the doorway, listening. The merchant spoke of needing someone trustworthy to manage his accounts, someone who could keep secrets as easily as numbers. The senator replied that trust came with a price and loyalty with a promise. Neither said Tyro's name, but both meant him. The night stretched on, and still no final decision was made. The merchant was shrewd, the senator patient. Lucius slipped in and out of the room, his face unreadable. Marcus returned to his quarters with a mind full of questions. Could he do something? Should he? Or was his concern a foolish risk in a world that prized silence over sentiment? He dreamed uneasily that night, of ledgers turning into cages, of coins that whispered names as they clinked against one another. He awoke before dawn, heart racing, the image of Tyro fading into the pale morning light. The following day brought an unexpected turn. A letter arrived for the senator, sealed with a red mark that Marcus had seen only once before, months ago. It was from a city, a summons of some kind. The senator read it twice, his jaw tight. Then, without warning, he postponed the trade. The merchant, clearly displeased, lingered for a few hours before leaving with vague promises to return. Tyro remained, for now, but the reprieve felt fragile, like a rope stretched too thin. Marcus sensed that this was not the end, only a pause. The ledger still bore the boy's name. The merchant still had his eye on him. And somewhere in the city, something had stirred enough to delay a deal, but not erase it. The villa returned to its quiet rhythm. But Marcus noticed how everyone moved with a certain tension, as if waiting for the next knock at the gate. Tyro stayed close to him in the following days, speaking little but watching much. The boy had a sharpness in his gaze now, a silent awareness of the fragile threads holding his life in place. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls with a warm, fleeting glow, Marcus found himself back in the garden where it all began. The olive trees whispered in the breeze. He wondered what lay ahead, not just for Tyro, but for himself. If a life could be delayed, could it also be reclaimed? Could a name be struck from a ledger not by sale, but by choice? The senator remained distant, Lucius watchful, and the merchant's absence felt less like a victory and more like the calm before something larger. There were other names in that ledger, other stories unfolding quietly in corners and courtyards all across Rome. Marcus could feel it now, the scale of it all, vast and indifferent. He picked an olive from the branch above and turned it in his fingers. The weight of that small fruit was nothing, yet it held within it the essence of the tree, the labor of hands, the patience of seasons. And in some strange way, it reminded him of the people in the senator's house. Each life a small weight in the hands of men who measured worth in silver and promises. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the merchant was already planning his return. Somewhere in the city, a decision was being written in wax and sealed in red. And in the quiet courtyard, Marcus began to wonder whether the story of those names, Tyro's, his own, and countless others, could ever be told without coins deciding their endings. Would the delay give them time to find another path, or only make the price higher when the day came? Would Marcus have the courage to act when the moment finally arrived? The night offered no answers, only the rustling of leaves and the steady rhythm of footsteps in a city that never truly slept. The days that followed felt like the stillness before a storm. The villa moved with a steady rhythm on the surface, but beneath it, there was a current that no one named aloud. Tyro kept close to Marcus, often helping him with small tasks, sweeping the walkway, carrying scrolls, tending to the lamp wicks. But his laughter had gone quiet. The merchant had left, yes, but he had left behind a shadow. Everyone knew he would return, and when he did, his purse would be heavier, his words more persuasive, and the ledger less forgiving. Marcus noticed how Lucius began to keep the ledgers nearer to him, as if the pause had made him wary of curious eyes. The senator, too, seemed changed. He spent long hours in his study, letters piling on his desk, his gaze distant even when he shared a meal with the household. Sometimes, at night, Marcus passed by the room and saw him sitting alone, a single lamp casting light on the lines of his face, the wax tablets spread before him like pieces of a game only he could see. The whispers among the staff grew quieter but sharper. Some said the senator was in debt. Others claimed the merchant had offered him more than just coins, that he had promised favors in distant ports, connections in the trade councils, opportunities that could not be bought easily in the markets of Rome. To most, it did not matter. What mattered was the outcome. For in a household such as this, the fate of one often signaled the fate of many. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the courtyard, Marcus and Tyro sat on the low wall by the garden. The scent of rosemary and thyme clung to the air. Tyro traced lines on the stone with a small stick, shapes that looked like numbers and stars. "Do you think they will take me when he comes back?" Tyro asked, his voice so soft Marcus almost missed it. Marcus hesitated. He wanted to tell the boy no, that things would change, that the delay had meant something. But the truth hung heavy on his tongue. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know you have more worth than what they write beside your name." Tyro looked up, his eyes catching the last of the fading light. "Worth doesn't stop the coins," he murmured. That night, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. The moon hung low, a pale coin in the sky, and the shadows of the olive trees reached across the courtyard like long fingers. He thought of his own place in the villa. He was free, yes, but his freedom was thin, a paper shield in a world built on bargains. If the senator decided tomorrow that his service was owed elsewhere, what could he do? He had no land, no powerful name, no patron to protect him. In the days that followed, the city sent more letters. Some bore seals Marcus did not recognize, marks of magistrates and merchants, each with its own weight. The senator's patience thinned, his temper sharper with each passing message. Lucius began to oversee more than the household's books. He started managing conversations, placing certain servants where they could not overhear, asking Marcus to carry notes that were folded so tightly he could not read their edges. The air grew heavy with waiting. At the market, whispers of new taxes and changing laws drifted like smoke. Ships in the port spoke of unrest in distant provinces. Everything felt uncertain, yet the one thing that seemed inevitable was the merchant's return. When he came, it was without warning. A cool morning, the mist still clinging to the fields, and the sound of wheels on stone broke the silence. Marcus felt his stomach knot as he recognized the deep blue cloak, the same calm, measuring eyes. The merchant brought no caravan this time, only a single chest carried by two men and a scroll tucked under his arm. The negotiations began at once, behind closed doors. Marcus was sent to bring water, then wine, then to leave them undisturbed. Hours passed, the sun climbed high, and still the doors remained shut. Outside, Tyro stood under the shade of the olive tree, his bundle ready once again. He no longer looked afraid. He looked hollow, as if the waiting had taken something from him. When the doors finally opened, the senator emerged with a face like carved stone. Lucius followed, his expression unreadable. The merchant smiled faintly, as though the game had gone his way. Marcus saw the scroll change hands, the seal broken, the ink still fresh. That evening, the household was called to the atrium. The senator spoke little, only enough to say that changes were coming, that arrangements had been made for the good of the estate, and that those whose names were chosen should prepare. He did not say Tyro's name aloud, but the boy stepped forward all the same. Marcus felt the air leave his chest. There was no protest in the courtyard, no cries or pleas. This was how it was done, quietly, with the weight of tradition pressing down on every word. The merchant watched from the edge, his hand resting lightly on the chest beside him, as if the matter were already sealed. Later, as the night settled over the villa, Marcus found himself back in the garden once more. The moon was brighter this time, casting sharp lines across the stone. Tyro's bundle lay near the gate, tied with a strip of worn cloth. He had gone to rest, or perhaps to dream of another city, another life. Marcus traced the grooves of the stone with his fingers, the same way Tyro had done with his stick. He thought of the ledgers, of the coins, of the choices made in quiet rooms by men who spoke of practicality while lives shifted beneath their hands. He wondered what it would take to change such a thing, not with anger, but with something stronger, something that could not be sealed with wax or measured with silver. The night felt longer than usual. Somewhere in the villa, Lucius was likely adding new lines to his ledger, and the senator was writing letters to secure the promises made that day. The merchant would leave at dawn, but his shadow would remain, stretching far beyond the courtyard, reaching into the very heart of Rome, where decisions like this were made 100 times over. Marcus lay awake until the first bird sang. He did not know yet what he would do, or if he could do anything at all, but he knew one thing. The story of that boy, and all the others whose names were written in ledgers, was not over. Not yet. The city would wake soon, the markets would open, and the wheels of trade would turn as they always did. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of the empire, there were still those who wondered if a single act, however small, could place even a crack in the stone of such a system. Would Marcus become one of them? Would Tyro find his fate sealed in a distant port, or carried elsewhere by some unforeseen turn? The olive trees swayed, whispering secrets to the dawn, and the answer lay somewhere beyond their reach. The night before the merchant was set to leave, the villa was heavy with silence. Even the usual sounds of the courtyard, the trickle of the fountain, the soft shuffle of sandals against stone, felt distant, as if the place itself was holding its breath. Marcus lay awake, staring at the faint glow of the oil lamp. He could hear Tyro breathing lightly in the room next to his, the boy's small bundle of belongings resting by the door. Tomorrow, that bundle would be gone. Tomorrow, a name would be erased from one ledger and written into another. He rose quietly, stepping out into the cool night. The moonlight fell in long, thin strips across the ground, casting the olive trees into strange shapes. Somewhere beyond those trees, the merchant's men kept watch, their shadows shifting by the gate. Marcus walked to the edge of the garden and stood there for a long time, staring at the road that led to the city. Every sound felt sharper tonight. The rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the low hum of wind against the stone walls. The thought had been growing in him for days now, like a seed pressing against the soil. If he did nothing, this would go on forever. Not just for Tyro, but for the others. The names in Lucius's ledger were more than ink. They were stories, and each coin exchanged for them left a mark. Yet what could one servant do in the heart of an empire built on trade and order? By morning, the villa was alive with activity. The merchant wanted to leave early to reach the city before midday. Lucius moved briskly, checking the chest, the scrolls, the accounts. The senator stood by the archway, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Marcus carried water to the kitchen, but his eyes kept drifting to the gate. Tyro stood there quietly, clutching his bundle, his face pale but calm. He looked older somehow, as if the waiting had carved lines where there should have been none. The merchant's men loaded the cart, their hands practiced and efficient. The sound of the chest being placed on the wood sent a chill through Marcus. It was the sound of something closing, something final. He tried to meet Tyro's eyes, but the boy was staring at the ground, as though if he did not look up, it would not happen. A moment came, brief but sharp, when the courtyard emptied for just a heartbeat. Lucius called away to check the letters. The merchant speaking in low tones with the senator, the servants scattered to their tasks. Marcus stepped closer to Tyro. "If you had a chance," he whispered, "would you run?" Tyro looked up, startled. His lips parted, but no words came. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but also something else, something that flickered like the flame of a lamp in the wind. Before Tyro could answer, a voice called from the archway. Lucius had returned, his eyes scanning the courtyard. The moment passed. Tyro lowered his head again, and the cart wheels creaked as the men made ready. As the sun climbed higher, the household gathered for a brief farewell. The senator spoke few words, formal, distant, practical. The merchant bowed his head, offered thanks, and gestured for his men to take the boy. Marcus felt his fists tighten at his sides. The sound of those footsteps, soft and deliberate on the stone, echoed in his chest. Then came a sound that shifted everything. The gate creaked open, and from the road came the gallop of a rider. Dust rose behind the horse as it approached, the rider carrying a sealed message tied to his arm. The merchant paused. The senator turned sharply, and Lucius hurried forward to meet the messenger. Marcus could not hear the words exchanged, but he saw the change in the senator's face as the seal broke. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set. The letter was short, written in haste. Whatever it contained, it was enough to halt the movement in the courtyard. The merchant frowned, tapping his fingers against the side of the cart, the impatience in his posture clear. Tyro froze, clutching his bundle tighter. The servants whispered among themselves, the air thick with confusion. The letter passed from the senator to Lucius, then back again. Orders were spoken, though too quietly for Marcus to hear. The merchant's men shifted uneasily, their hands on the cart ropes, waiting. Marcus's heart pounded. Something had changed. Not an escape, not yet, but a delay. Another delay, sharp and sudden. The merchant did not leave at once. Instead, he followed the senator into the hall, his voice low but edged with tension. The servants were dismissed, though Marcus lingered near the doorway, his breath shallow as he tried to catch fragments of the conversation. The letter spoke of a change in the city, a review of certain trades, a call for names to be listed and transactions to be recorded more openly. It was not a ban, but it was a pause, a warning. Someone was watching. The merchant argued. His voice grew louder, the words sharp like the clink of coins poured onto a table. "You delay again," he said. "Each day is cost. Each day I lose." The senator replied, steady but firm. "Each day is also risk. I will not lose more than I must." Lucius said nothing, only stood with his stylus pressed between his fingers, his eyes flicking to Marcus for a heartbeat before turning away. The cart remained in the courtyard that night, the chest unopened, the ropes loosened but not undone. Tyro slept near the kitchen again, his bundle at his side, his breath shallow. Marcus sat by the window, staring at the moonlit path beyond the gate. The tension in the villa was now a living thing, coiling through the halls, whispering through the olive leaves. The merchant was not used to waiting. His men paced. His temper thinned. The senator, usually calm, grew quiet and distant. Lucius sharpened his gaze, watching every servant, every glance, every step. Marcus knew that whatever choice was coming, it would not wait much longer. And so the night stretched, thick with anticipation. Somewhere in the city, decisions were being made, and somewhere along the road, more riders might come with seals that could change everything once again. The chest gleamed in the moonlight, the cart stood ready, and the boy with the sharp mind lay still, caught between two worlds that measured him by what they could gain or lose. Marcus felt the weight of it pressing against him. He did not yet know what he would do, only that the moment to decide was drawing closer. Closer with each hoofbeat on the distant road, closer with each quiet word traded in the senator's hall, closer with each name written in wax and each coin counted by lamplight. Would the dawn bring departure? Would the seal of the city hold? Or would the merchant take what he came for, leaving behind only the sound of cart wheels fading into the distance? The night gave no answer, only the restless whisper of the olive trees and the cold glint of the moon. The following morning was heavy with unease. The sun had barely broken over the hills when a merchant was already pacing the courtyard, his cloak drawn tight against the early chill. His men kept to their duties, but their eyes betrayed impatience. The cart, still packed and ready, stood beneath the shadow of the gate like a beast waiting for release. Tyro sat on the low stone steps near the fountain, silent, his small bundle at his side, hands folded as though bracing for whatever news would come. Marcus felt the weight of every moment stretch. The household moved with quiet urgency, servants carrying jugs of water, cooks preparing a hasty meal, Lucius slipping in and out of the senator's study with his wax tablets. The letter from the city still lay on the table, its seal broken, but its message unresolved. Marcus caught fragments of hushed conversation, lists being drawn, new orders being spoken, names being discussed in tones that held both caution and calculation. He wondered if the city truly meant to change how such trade was done, or if this was simply another measure of control, a reminder that even those who thought themselves masters were always answering to someone higher. For men like the merchant, every day was profit measured against risk. For boys like Tyro, every hour was a thread pulled taut between fate and fortune. By mid-morning, the senator finally stepped into the courtyard. His expression was unreadable, a mask carved from patience and pride. The merchant turned to him at once, his voice rising. "We lose time. I was promised this delivery would be simple. Each delay cost me. And you." The senator raised a hand, quieting him with the same authority he used in the Senate Hall. "The city's decree cannot be ignored. There's talk of new records of oversight. If your name is entered on the wrong list, you will not lose a day. You will lose a season, perhaps more." Marcus noticed how the merchant's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near the clasp of his cloak. "And what of the boy? Am I to camp in your courtyard like a fool while scribes in the city play with ink?" The senator's eyes moved briefly to Tyro, who sat still, pretending not to hear. "The boy remains here until I receive word. That is final." It was not the answer the merchant wanted, but it was one he could not easily challenge. He turned sharply, muttering under his breath as he strode toward the gate. His men followed, restless, their boots striking the stone with irritation. The cart stayed where it was, a reminder of a trade paused, but not yet undone. Marcus felt something shift in the air, a crack in the rhythm that had seemed so certain only days before. He glanced at Tyro, who now looked up for the first time in hours. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither looked away. Later, when the midday meal was cleared and the courtyard emptied once again, Marcus approached him. "You heard them," he said quietly. "It's not over. Not yet." Tyro nodded slowly. "But it will be. They always finish what they start." Marcus hesitated. "Not always. Sometimes something changes. Sometimes someone makes a change." The boy studied him, his gaze sharper than his years. "And what would you do?" he asked. "Would you change it? For me?" Marcus opened his mouth but found no answer that felt true. There were too many eyes in this house, too many ears waiting for a word to twist. Instead, he said only, "If a chance comes, you must see it for what it is, even if it is small." The days that followed were a strange kind of waiting. The merchant sent riders to the city, demanding clarity. The senator received more letters, each one carrying the weight of decisions made far beyond the olive groves. The chest remained sealed, its contents untouched, while Lucius grew sharper with every passing day, his notes filled with numbers and names, his glances lingering too long on the servants' faces. Rumors began to stir among them, whispers of a new census in the city, of officials traveling from estate to estate, counting not only the wealth of landowners, but the lives they held in their ledgers. Some said it was about order. Others said it was about control. For Marcus, it was a slow tightening of the rope. He felt it in the way the merchant's men grew restless, in the way Lucius's voice became more clipped, in the way the senator now walked the halls late at night, his steps echoing like a man balancing gain against risk. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of red and gold, Marcus found himself standing by the outer wall, staring at the road. The merchant's riders had not returned. The city was silent. The cart still waited, like a shadow that refused to move. Tyro joined him, his steps light, his voice quiet. "Do you think they will take me?" Marcus did not look at him at first. "I think they will try. I think they will wait as long as they must, then they will go." "And if I ran?" the boy asked, his voice barely more than breath. Marcus turned now, his eyes searching the boy's face. "You would need more than legs. You would need a place to hide, someone to help, someone willing to pay the price." Tyro looked away, toward the distant hills. "Then I will wait. Waiting is what they expect. It's what I know." Night fell again, and with it, the villa grew still. But beneath that stillness was a current, a movement too slow to see yet strong enough to pull everything towards something inevitable. Marcus could feel it in his bones. The merchant would not wait forever. The senator would not risk his name without gain. And the city, whatever new order it whispered of, had not spoken its final word. There would be a moment, soon, when the quiet would break. Perhaps with the sound of hoofbeats at the gate. Perhaps with a command shouted in the courtyard. Perhaps with a decision made not by those who held the coins, but by someone who had only their courage to trade. For now, the cart waited. The chest gleamed in the moonlight, and the boy clutched his bundle like an anchor in a storm. Marcus lay awake once more, his thoughts restless, his resolve unsettled. Somewhere, in the silence of the night, the choice was already forming. Though whose choice it would be, and what price it would carry, no one yet knew. Would the next sunrise bring freedom or chains? Would the road beyond the olive trees carry away a boy, or a chance long denied? The night gave no hint, only the soft, steady sound of the fountain and the flicker of a lamp burning low. The following days became a tangle of whispers and waiting. The villa no longer felt like a place of routine, but rather a house holding its breath. The servants moved quietly, glancing often at the cart in the courtyard. Its wheels collected dust as the sun rose and fell, each day carrying with it a question that no one dared to speak aloud. The merchant had grown restless, his temper snapping like dry twigs underfoot. He sent 2 more riders to the city, each one vanishing into the distance with promises to return bearing answers. Yet the road stayed empty. Marcus began to notice how the senator's manner had changed. He was a man accustomed to control, to making decisions that bent others to his will, but now he lingered by the gates at dusk, his arms folded, his eyes narrowed at the horizon as though the hills themselves had turned against him. At night, he spoke with Lucius for long stretches in the study, their voices low but tense. The words names, lists, and census drifted out into the hall like threads of smoke that refused to settle. Tyro, too, had changed in the waiting. He no longer asked questions, no longer tried to catch Marcus's gaze at every turn. Instead, he moved through the villa like a shadow, silent, deliberate, watchful. His small bundle was never far from his side. Once, Marcus passed him in the storeroom, standing on a stool to reach for a jar of oil. He paused there for a long time, fingers brushing the shelf, his face half lit by the morning sun. It struck Marcus then how thin the boy's shoulders looked, how heavy the quiet around him had become. One evening, Marcus was sent to deliver a tray of wine to the senator's hall. The doors were half open, and as he stepped closer, he heard a name that stopped him in his tracks, his own. "Marcus has been here long," Lucius was saying. "He sees more than he should." The senator's voice followed, calm but edged. "He is loyal, but even loyalty can bend under the wrong weight. Keep watch." Marcus moved on quickly, his steps steady though his heart raced. From that moment, he felt their eyes more keenly. The merchant's men lingering near the kitchen, Lucius scanning the servants' faces at dawn. Every gesture felt heavy, every whisper seemed a threat. The merchant himself had taken to walking the outer paths of the villa in the evenings, his cloak drawn, his boots leaving deep marks in the dust. Marcus passed him one night near the olive press. "You've been here some years, haven't you?" the merchant said, his tone almost casual. "Yes," Marcus replied, keeping his gaze steady. "Then you know how these things go," the merchant continued. "Delay is a game, a costly one, but games end one way or another." Marcus said nothing. The merchant studied him for a moment longer, then turned away, his cloak catching the last of the fading light. It was after that encounter that Marcus began to notice small signs. Doors left slightly ajar, letters sealed in haste, riders taking the lower path rather than the main road. Something was moving, quietly, beneath the surface of the villa's stillness. And then, one cold dawn, a new letter arrived. This time, it bore the seal of a different hand, one Marcus did not recognize. The senator broke it open in the courtyard with a merchant standing close by. Their faces, lit by the first pale light of morning, told more than their words. The merchant's lips curled into a thin, sharp smile. The senator's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly to Tyro. Orders were given. The cart was to be prepared again. The merchant's men moved with renewed purpose, their boots loud against the stone. Lucius hurried from room to room, collecting the papers that had been set aside. Marcus found Tyro by the fountain, staring at the water. "It's happening," the boy whispered, his voice flat. "They will leave soon." Marcus crouched beside him. "Then you must decide. Will you go quietly, or will you look for that moment?" Tyro shook his head. "There is no moment. Only roads that lead the same way." "Not always," Marcus said, though he felt the weight of doubt press against his words. That day, the villa buzzed like a hive. Servants were sent running with last-minute errands. The merchant checked the chest twice, and the senator gave his farewells with a face like carved stone. As the sun lowered, the cart was brought once again to the gate. The merchant climbed aboard, his cloak gathered tightly, his fingers drumming against the wooden side. Lucius stood beside the senator, tablet in hand, waiting to mark the final note of the exchange. Tyro stepped forward, his bundle clutched tight. He did not cry. He did not plead. He walked as though each step was drawn in chalk, and he was merely tracing it. Marcus stood among the servants, his hands folded, his heart pounding like a drum beneath his tunic. He could hear the creak of the wheels, the shift of the chest, the merchant calling for the reins. And then, a sound on the road. Not the thunder of hooves this time, but the slow, deliberate clatter of another cart approaching from the hills. Dust rose in the twilight, and a second team of horses came into view, bearing the colors of the city. The merchant cursed under his breath. The senator stiffened. Lucius stepped forward, his stylus poised. The gate opened wider, and the new cart rolled in, flanked by two officials in dark cloaks, their faces unreadable. The courtyard stilled. The servants froze where they stood. Even the merchant's men fell silent. Marcus felt the moment stretch, as though the air itself had thickened. He glanced at Tyro, whose eyes widened, not in fear this time, but in something closer to recognition. The officials dismounted without a word. One carried a scroll sealed in black wax, the other a small wooden chest. They spoke briefly with the senator, their voices low, their expressions tight. Whatever words were exchanged, they were not meant for common ears. The merchant shifted impatiently, his hands clenching at his sides. "Well," he demanded, "will we stand here all night?" The taller of the two officials turned to him at last. "There has been a change," he said simply. Marcus could not hear the rest, only the rise and fall of voices, the sudden ripple of unease that passed through the courtyard like a cold wind. The scroll was opened, the black wax cracked. Tyro stood very still, his bundle slipping slightly in his grasp. Something in that letter had the power to halt everything, or to set it in motion in a way none of them expected. And as the shadows grew long across the stones, Marcus realized that the night ahead would decide far more than the cost of a boy or the profit of a trade. It would decide whose name would be remembered when the city scribes came calling, and whose would vanish into the ledgers without a trace. Would the cart leave before dawn? Would the officials seize what they came for? Or would the road remain, as it had for so many nights, waiting for a decision no one dared yet to make? The courtyard was still holding its breath when the taller official stepped forward, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "The city has issued a new directive," he said, the black-sealed scroll still open in his hands. "Certain transactions are to be reviewed, and certain names are to remain where they are, at least for now." The merchant's face tightened, his fingers twitching against his cloak. "This is madness," he said sharply. "I have waited long enough. I have paid in coin, in time, in patience. You cannot simply halt a lawful trade with a whisper from the city." The official's gaze was steady, unreadable. "We do not halt it," he replied. "We re-examine it. There are questions about the ledger you carry, about the movement of wealth and the weight of names. Until those questions are answered, the boy stays." The words rippled through the courtyard like a stone cast into still water. Lucius's eyes flicked to the senator, waiting for his cue, while the merchant's men shifted uneasily by the cart. Tyro stood frozen, the bundle slipping a little in his grip. Marcus, standing among the other servants, felt a strange current stir beneath the surface of things. He had expected the city's interference to delay, to tangle, to complicate, but this was something more. This was a hand placed directly between the merchant and his gain, and men like him did not take kindly to such hands. The merchant's voice dropped lower now, sharper, like the edge of a blade kept hidden until the last moment. "If I return to the city empty-handed," he said, "I do not only lose profit, I lose position. There are debts waiting to be answered, favors already spoken for. Do you know what it costs to gather a chest like this, to keep men fed on the road, to make promises to men with influence?" The official did not flinch. "Do you know what it costs to anger the Senate?" A murmur passed through the courtyard. The senator said nothing, but the slight movement of his hand told Marcus he was weighing every word, every outcome. Night fell swiftly after that exchange, but the courtyard did not rest. The merchant argued late into the evening, his men pacing like caged wolves. The officials remained in the villa, their presence a quiet warning that no decision would be made without their word. Tyro was sent back to the small room near the kitchen, but his sleep was shallow, his face pale in the lamplight. It was past midnight when Marcus, restless and unable to sleep, passed near the hall and caught the sound of something he had not expected. Another letter being read aloud. This one carried not by a writer, but by a hand within the villa itself. "There are suspicions," Lucius whispered, the words barely rising above the crackle of the lamp. "An account missing coin. A shipment declared and never arrived." The city's eyes grow sharper, not softer. Marcus paused in the shadows. Missing coin? A shipment lost? It struck him then that this was not only about the boy or the chest or the merchant's delays. This was larger, tangled, and dangerous. If the merchant's trade was more than it seemed, if there were debts hidden behind his demands, then the boy was not just a name in a ledger. He was a thread in a web that stretched all the way to the heart of the city. The next day brought a second shock, one that none in the villa had expected. A rider arrived, not for the senator, nor for the merchant, but for the officials themselves. The seal on the message was marked with urgency, and when they broke it open, their faces darkened. Another inventory, one said. Not here, in the next estate. The merchant pounced on the moment. Then you leave? You abandon your watch. The official's jaw tightened. We leave to do our duty. But the city has ordered that nothing is to leave these gates until our return. It was a loophole, thin but visible, and Marcus saw it the moment the words were spoken. The officials would leave, but they would not take the chest. The merchant would remain, but his patience was breaking. And the senator, bound by law and coin alike, will be forced to hold his ground in a storm that no longer moved in one direction. That evening, as the last of the officials' horses vanished into the hills, the villa seemed to hold its tension like a bowstring drawn too far. The merchant stalked the halls, his voice sharp with threats half-made. Lucius kept his tablet close, his notes now layered with names and numbers Marcus dared not imagine. Tyro clutched his bundle as though it had become part of his body. Marcus found himself standing by the olive trees once again, staring at the distant road. "It's changing," he murmured, though no one was there to hear him. "Something else is coming." And he was right, for when the moon climbed high, there came a sound from the road. Not the clatter of hooves or the creak of wheels, but a single, measured knock at the gate. A lone figure stood there, cloaked, unarmed, carrying only a small satchel and a message for the senator. Marcus watched as the gate opened and the figure stepped in, his face hidden by the hood. He spoke quietly with the gatekeeper, then with Lucius, and finally was led into the hall. No one saw him leave again that night. By morning, the cart had been moved. Not far, only a few paces closer to the gate. The merchant said nothing, but his men kept their hands near their belts. The senator's temper had cooled to a dangerous calm, and Lucius moved with the kind of quiet that made Marcus's skin crawl. Something had been decided in those dark hours. Not by decree, not by seal, but by men whose names would not be written on any scroll. And somewhere in the middle of it, Tyro stood waiting, the boy who was worth more in coin than he ever should have been, his fate balanced between ledgers, letters, and a shadow. The room fell silent as the pieces of the puzzle finally connected. What had seemed like separate incidents, random and chaotic, were now clearly part of a deliberate plan. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, scattered between the subtle hints everyone had overlooked, and now it all converged into a moment that none of them could have prepared for. The person they had trusted most, the one who had been standing beside them, had been pulling the strings all along. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a carefully calculated move that had been years in the making, and its impact hit harder than anyone could have imagined. The confrontation was tense, each word weighed down with anger, disbelief, and the need for answers. No one had expected the trail to lead here, to this exact place where secrets had been buried under layers of trust. The stakes were no longer just about uncovering the truth. They were about survival, about understanding how deep the deception went and how far the consequences would stretch. With every passing second, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the realization spread that everything they had worked for was now hanging by a thread. They demanded to know why the lies, why the manipulation, why the careful weaving of a narrative that had caused so much harm. The answer that came was not what they wanted to hear. It wasn't about money or fame, or even revenge. It was about control, about shaping a future according to a vision that no one else had agreed to. The plan had been set in motion long before anyone realized, and by the time they caught on, it was almost too late to stop it. The depth of the betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just about actions, it was about trust given freely and used as a weapon. As voices rose and tempers flared, a final piece of information was revealed, one that twisted the entire situation once again. The person at the center of it all wasn't acting alone. There was another player, someone still in the shadows, orchestrating moves from behind the scenes. This revelation shifted the room's energy instantly. What they thought was an ending was only the edge of something larger, something still waiting to unfold. The betrayal they uncovered was just one layer, and beneath it lay a network far more dangerous and far-reaching than they had prepared for. With the climax building, decisions had to be made fast. Every second mattered. and hesitation would mean giving that hidden force more time to act. The team split, each taking a role, each ready to face the fallout of choices made under pressure. They moved not just with urgency, but with a heavy sense of responsibility. The truth had been exposed, but the cost was still unfolding. It wasn't the victory they had imagined. It was messier, heavier, and left them wondering if they had truly won it all. The final twist struck when they thought they had regained control. A message appeared, simple yet chilling, hinting that the story was not over. The real architect had left a mark, a signal that they were still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to move the pieces again. It sent a ripple of uncertainty through everyone present. Even in their moment of triumph, there was no comfort, only the realization that this was the beginning of a larger game, one they were now unwillingly a part of. The night ended not with cheers, but with a quiet resolve. The main conflict had been confronted, the immediate threat dismantled, but the scars it left were deep. Trust would be harder to rebuild, alliances more fragile than ever, and every decision from here on would carry the weight of what they had learned. The story didn't close neatly. It ended with a promise, unspoken but understood, that they would be ready for what came next. The air was heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. No one spoke for a long time, each person lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted and the truths that had been unearthed. The room that once felt familiar now carried an edge of unease, like every shadow might still be hiding a secret. It wasn't just about the events of that night anymore. It was about the cracks those events had revealed, the fragile bonds that now felt tested in ways they had never imagined. Every glance carried questions unspoken. Who could they still trust? And what would tomorrow bring? Outside, the night carried on as though nothing had changed. Cars moved in the distance, streetlights flickered, and the world continued unaware of the storm that had raged in that small space. It was strange, almost cruel, how normalcy could exist side by side with something so intense. They stepped outside one by one, the cool air brushing against their skin like a reminder that the world was still turning, even when everything in their lives had been upended. Conversations were hushed, fragmented. No one had the energy to voice everything they were feeling, not yet. Some of them replayed the moments leading up to the climax over and over, searching for signs they should have seen earlier. The little comments, the delayed answers, the unexplained disappearances, they were all there, waiting to be pieced together. Hindsight had a way of making everything clear, but it also carried its own kind of burden. How much pain could they have prevented if they had been quicker, sharper, less willing to give the benefit of the doubt? Those thoughts lingered like a bitter aftertaste that no one wanted to admit aloud. The second twist, that someone else had been quietly shaping the path behind the scenes, cast a long shadow over any sense of resolution they might have had. It meant the story wasn't over. It meant that even as they celebrated a small victory, a larger force was regrouping somewhere in the dark. That knowledge settled in their stomachs like a stone. They were not finished, and worse, they might only be at the beginning of something much bigger. That realization carried both fear and a strange, unexpected determination. Plans were made quietly in the days that followed. Not the kind that were written down or announced, but the kind that lived in quiet nods and silent understandings. They would watch more closely now, ask questions they had once avoided, dig deeper even when the answers made them uncomfortable. Each of them carried their own scars from what had happened, and those scars became a kind of fuel. They didn't want to be blindsided again, not by this and not by anything like it. One of them, the one who had been most deeply hurt by the betrayal, struggled the most to move forward. Nights were long and restless, haunted by replayed conversations and the constant wondering of whether the signs had been there all along. Healing didn't come easily, and trust felt like something fragile, almost foolish, to offer again. But in the quiet moments, there was also resolve. Pain had a way of hardening people, but it could also sharpen them, make them more aware, more determined to stand their ground. As weeks turned into months, life began to take on a strange new rhythm. The immediate chaos had passed, but its echoes lingered in unexpected ways, a tense silence in once lively gatherings, a pause before answering a phone call, a second glance at a stranger's face in the crowd. They weren't living in fear exactly, but in a kind of watchfulness that only came from knowing how quickly things could change. It was as if a thin layer of frost had settled over their world, subtle, cold, and not easily melted. Then, just when it seemed like they were finding a way to live with the scars, another message arrived. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a few lines, simple, precise, chilling in their timing. It was a reminder that the one they hadn't caught, the one still in the shadows, hadn't disappeared. They were still there, waiting, moving quietly. The message didn't threaten outright, but it didn't have to. It was enough to stir all the old tension, to make them realize the game hadn't ended. It had only paused. And in that moment, something shifted. Fear gave way to focus. They had been caught off guard before, but now they were ready to move with intention. They had survived the first wave, and now they would prepare for the next. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure the cycle didn't repeat, about protecting what they still had, and about being ready when the next move came. The dust finally began to settle, not in an instant, but slowly, like the way morning fog lifts after a long night. The events that had unfolded left everyone with a mix of relief and heaviness. The unanswered questions had found their way to the surface, and while not every mystery had been solved perfectly, enough of the truth was now out in the open for people to breathe again. It wasn't the kind of ending where everyone walked away smiling, but it was one where they could walk away at all, carrying lessons they hadn't expected to learn. Cassius, who had once been so curious and restless about the hidden workings of the Empire, finally understood the cost of the system he had spent so much time studying. He thought he knew what Roman society was built on: roads, trade, armies, power, but what truly held it together were the silent lives that often went unseen. The slaves he had met along the way, the merchants who risked everything to cross dangerous roads, the farmers who tilled soil not for wealth but for survival. All of them were threads in the great fabric of that world. He could no longer walk through the streets of Rome without seeing their faces in the crowd, without wondering how much of their lives had been spent paying for the luxury of others. Sophia, who had struggled with her own past and the family she had lost to the cruelty of that system, found herself at a crossroads too. For so long, her life had been about trying to change what little she could without being noticed. But now, with the truth exposed and the shadows dragged into the light, she realized change often starts with a whisper, not a shout. She began quietly helping those still trapped, using the knowledge they had uncovered to guide others toward freedom, or at least toward fair treatment. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. Marcus, the old scholar who had helped them trace the origins of those hidden trades and transactions, finally set down his quills with a sense of peace. For years he had recorded the Empire's history without daring to question its darker corners. Now he had seen what those records could do when read by the right eyes. History, he realized, wasn't just for the victors. It was for the watchers, the ordinary people who needed to remember so they would not repeat the same paths again. He began writing differently, not just dates and names, but the stories of those who lived in the margins. The city itself moved on, as cities always do. The markets reopened, the baths filled again, and the senators returned to their endless debates. Most people never knew the details of what had been uncovered, but they felt its quiet ripple. There were fewer unexplained disappearances. There was a little more caution in the way trades were made and records kept. It wasn't enough to rewrite the empire overnight, but in the lives of those who had fought quietly for it, it was something. As for the cost of Roman slaves, the question that had started it all, Cassius finally wrote down the numbers he had once sought. The coin values, the records from old auctions, the prices that shifted with age, skill, and strength. But now, those numbers no longer looked like neat columns on parchment. They looked like lives reduced to sums, like laughter and hope turned into silver and bronze. He included them in his work, but not as a curiosity, as a warning. He wrote about the people behind those numbers, the cooks who made feasts possible, the children forced into service, the men who built roads under the sun until their hands bled. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Tiber River, the small group gathered one last time. There was no ceremony, no speeches. They shared bread, olives, and wine in a quiet courtyard, each person aware that this was the end of their shared chapter. Sophia looked at Cassius and said softly, "Do you think they will remember any of this? Not the names or the places, but the truth of it." Cassius paused, watching the river catch the last of the light. "Maybe not all at once," he said, "but stories have a way of finding their way through, even the boring ones." That night, the streets of Rome felt different. The lamps flickered as usual, the carts rattled over the cobblestones, but for those who had walked through the storm, there was a sense of quiet triumph. Not the kind sung by poets or carved in marble, but the kind that lives in the heart when you know you have done something that mattered, even if no one else sees it. They had faced corruption, greed, and silence, and they had chosen to act. Time passed, and each went their own way. Marcus returned to his scrolls. Sophia continued her quiet work, and Cassius began teaching, sharing what he had learned not as a lecture, but as a story about cost, about value, about the human lives behind ancient figures that often looked so cold on paper. And somewhere, in the markets and streets, those who once felt invisible began to find small signs of change. A kinder word from a merchant. A fair deal struck without force. A child who would not be sold because someone decided to say no. In the end, that was the truth the story carried. Not that the world could change overnight, but that it could shift with every choice, every act of courage, every quiet stand taken when no one was watching. The Roman Empire, with all its marble and might, would rise and fall as history demanded. But the people, the ones whose names rarely made the records, were the ones who carried its real heartbeat. And as the last page of this story closed, one simple reflection lingered. History is never as distant as it seems. The numbers we read, the prices we note, the systems we study, they all lived once in the hands, the voices, and the sacrifices of real people. Remembering them, even in the stillness of a story told for sleep, is how we keep their lives from vanishing entirely.